Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason. With me today is my co-host, Janelle Blue. Janelle is president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, which is our sponsoring organization. And our guest today is LaBrenda Garrett-Nelson. LaBrenda is a retired former tax attorney, and she is a certified genealogist, a certified genealogical lecturer, and a trustee with the Board for Certification of Genealogists. And today we're going to talk about ethics in DNA. And ethical questions about anything in genealogy is something that has been around for a long time, but DNA brings up kind of a whole new picture about how we handle things. So what would we like to start off with, LaBrenda?
Well, I'm going to first start off by just reminding our viewers that I am a trustee of the Board for Certification, but am not speaking on behalf of BCG. I'm just giving you my personal views. The founding trustees of the Board for Certification of Genealogists developed the PHL's first ethics code back in 1964. And it was updated, I think, in 1994, but the basic principles remain the same. The press release that announced the recent revisions to the Code of Ethics pointed out one important distinction between other types of evidence and DNA evidence. And that is that genealogists usually are researching deceased ancestors or deceased relatives. DNA evidence is normally obtained from living people, and that presents privacy issues that other types of evidence don't necessarily prevent. So when the board announced the revision of genealogy standards, the book, it also announced revisions to DNA-specific revisions to the Code of Ethics. And to just go over them very, very briefly, there is, it's entitled, there's a new section entitled "To Protect People Who Provide DNA." And it requires informed consent, and it requires you to have real conversations with folk about how you intend to use their DNA, that you make sure they understand the limitations of the privacy that's afforded. Everyone would like to try to test with companies that respect their privacy, but we've had some recent current events that I'm sure we're going to talk about that has made clear to folks that that's not always going to happen. And also, just explaining that there really are no guarantees of complete privacy, but there are things we can and should do.
Well, and it's just like the old ways of doing research. You know, there are things that may be restricted that would keep a family secret, but eventually they're going to reach that point where the law expires and they're going to open up, and new surprises are going to come out. I uncovered one, not that it was really hidden, but I had a great aunt and uncle that divorced. And it was after I really examined the 1940 census and realized that my great aunt had a big D in the marital status column. And of course, initially I wasn't surprised that he wasn't in the household because he had gone back into the military in World War II. And I figured he was gone by the time the census. Well, when I started exploring that big D, found out they were divorced, and actually the 1930 census was a lie. They were separated at that point. So, but there, all of the parties involved were long since deceased. So it wasn't something that was, anything I really needed to worry about.
But that's a great example of how traditional genealogical research has the same potential to reveal unexpected information. But when it comes to DNA, the new standard specifically requires that you explain risks and consequences, such as unanticipated relatives. And unanticipated ethnic backgrounds. I've had blonde-haired, blue-eyed people come up to me after lectures to tell me about their 2% sub-Saharan African DNA. Some people welcome that news, some people don't. But the thought is that when you ask people to test, whether they're your relatives or you're assisting people as a professional genealogist, that you explain these possibilities and work out some plan ahead of time for how you will handle them. At least understand whether people will want to be told about these unexpected outcomes that can happen.
And it's also important that you yourself feel knowledgeable enough so that you are telling them everything, revealing everything, and telling them accurately what could happen.
And that goes to also in your choice of testing companies, making sure that you've read the terms of use and that you understand the limits of the privacy limitations that the company will enforce.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the commercial companies, most of the commercial companies that are considered private information, that they will advertise that it is very private, but there are some open-ended companies where that raw data can be inserted into that, and that's a whole different issue, which I'm sure you're going to go into.
Yeah, that goes into understanding when third parties will have access to your data, or at least your test results. The genealogist needs to understand and needs to inform the test taker that once test results are made publicly available, that others can kind of freely access them. And we saw the case that received the most publicity back in April of this year when law enforcement officials made use of GEDmatch, which is a public database that many genealogists have been using because they offer great tools and analytical tools. They used it, they collected DNA from a crime scene and then used that public database to identify the Golden State Killer. And since then, other criminals have been brought to justice
right.
using GEDmatch. And
so it can be a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, yeah, and people need to understand that. There are, I've seen Facebook posts where established genetic genealogists, at least one, has recommended just taking your data off of GEDmatch, but you can limit public access to what is viewable on GEDmatch, but which kind of defeats the purpose of using that facility.
Right. Maybe we should just back up for a second and differentiate between like Ancestry or 23andMe and GEDmatch.
Well, yes, because the direct-to-consumer tests that are available from Family Tree DNA and Ancestry, and My Heritage is another one, 23andMe. One, they are password protected, they're behind a paywall, they're not open to the public. And they all have different rules for when you can contact a match and how you can contact a match. And but even with those, so we're not talking about those, we're talking about GEDmatch, which is the third-party tool that is free that most folk had gravitated towards, mainly because of all of the analytical tools that are available. This whole new world of using it by law enforcement officials using it has just kind of stirred some controversy about whether folks should continue using it in that way. It's unfortunate that this is happening because it's not, but it is, again, another one of those unexpected results. People didn't expect that by uploading to GEDmatch, they would be kind of fingering some possibly third or fourth cousin whom law enforcement has an interest in.
But if you take the Ancestry test, I mean, it doesn't automatically mean that it's ever going to be able to get to GEDmatch, right?
Oh, absolutely. You have to affirmatively upload your results.
Right.
And the thing is that you use a pseudonym, and you can even use create an email just to attach to that purposes of that test. So there are workarounds, but there is so much information available on the World Wide Web today that allows folk to trace you even if you haven't done this. But the focus on the Golden State Killer is what kind of brought this to everyone's attention. And there, just within the last 2 weeks, there was a blog post by a genealogist on Facebook about a cousin receiving an email from someone a genealogist who did identify him or herself as someone working as an agent of law enforcement, and then proceeded to ask a lot of personal information about a distant third or fourth cousin who may or may not have committed a violent crime. And it is disturbing. It would be disturbing to receive an email like that. It was followed by Judy Russell, the legal genealogist, did a blog post pointing out some of the things that the writer of that email did correctly, which was identifying themselves as an agent of law enforcement. But one of the things they didn't do right was to think that it wouldn't matter to the recipient that even a distant cousin is suspected of some violent crime. Even that information would cause consternation in a family, and people should be more sensitive about that.
Yeah.
And there should be more safeguards and more of a procedure for folk to, if they were willing to help law enforcement, to know who they're dealing with and who you're acting on behalf of. There are lots of questions that this all raises.
Well, and of course, the other side of the coin is, does the person being contacted really know that much about this distant cousin? I mean, I have distant cousins that I have, as a result of genealogy, made contact with, but as far as really knowing a whole lot about them, I know almost zip. I know we have the common ancestors and we've shared information, those kinds of things, but beyond that,
But if you even know the common ancestor, that gives them some amount of information.
That does.
And it still would be, I would think, just kind of disturbing to learn that someone related to you is suspected of, I think the email referred to a violent crime. So that is the kind of privacy issue that is now highlighted by this Golden State Killer case and the cases that have come after it.
Well, and of course, it's one of those things that we really, as genealogists, we deal with lots of things that ethically we find things, and how much do we tell people? I mean, I know things that, within my family that I will tell certain individuals, but I don't put it out there.
And that is already in the Code of Ethics and was actually clarified in this rewrite, so that the new provision now says, I will keep confidential any personal or genealogical information disclosed to me except to the extent I receive consent to share. So it's just made crystal clear that as genealogists, we have an ethical obligation to preserve the confidentiality of information given to us.
An example that I think about is someone I know who had an uncle who had a family, but this was his second wife, not his first. He had a first wife and had a whole nother family. And the second family knew nothing about it until she accidentally let it slip. And, cousins some of them were upset, some of them didn't think it was a big deal.
But I think when a person tests that, it's easy to just check that little block that says I've read the terms and conditions. But there is one little blurb underneath, and I can't quote it exactly, but it basically says you may learn things that could be disturbing, or I don't know what the language is, but it's sort of that. And so you might learn that you have a child out there that you didn't know about, or that you have a sibling, or that your parent is not your parent.
Well, I hope if you have a child out there that you know something, that you know you had a child, but it's more likely a sibling.
Well, if it's a male, it could.
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah, there are definitely cases where, a woman gets pregnant and the relationship ends, and she does not let the father know that she's pregnant.
That's rare, I
think. As a child.
But the main point is that testers need to understand, and you as someone asking someone to test should make sure they understand that you never can really guarantee complete anonymity. However we're doing this.
Just look at systems get hacked all the time. And so even the large corporations can't guarantee privacy. So
a lot of this, the thrust of the revision to the Code of Ethics was just to make sure that you get consent and that it's informed consent because of all the things that could go wrong. But you had a great example too, when we were talking off camera about disclosures, not the one where someone accidentally disclosed something, but things that can be revealed through traditional documentary research, not just.
My great aunt and uncle being divorced, that was just documents that proved that, and of course, what I did was I went on, and fortunately, Louisiana divorces are open, so I was able to get the entire file, and that's how I found out that the 1930 census was a total fairy tale. He's listed in the household, but he actually was living in a boarding house in 1930. And the other thing that resulted from finding the divorce file and then going back and re-examining, he wasn't in the military yet when the census was taken. He was living with his second wife. So I opened up a whole new thing. All three of his children are deceased, and so far I haven't found where the one daughter who did marry had any children. So, I haven't found anything there. So it was just like my cousins and all, and a couple of aunts by marriage. But, it was one of those things that the family interacted and all, even after he was gone. Nobody knew. So the divorce.
Really, you need written authorization, don't you?
Well, you need consent, and it could be by to obtain the DNA. I think the standard refers to signed consent, but yes, it does. Yeah. You're going to request and comply with the signed consent, and it's an informed consent because you've already explained all of this to the risk, the risk of unexpected results, the risk that third parties will be able to access your test results if you agree to upload to something like a GEDmatch, and just the privacy concerns. But and the other thing is it extends to writing and lecturing. You really have to be careful when you lecture on these subjects that you have you either have to change names and use pseudonyms, or make sure that you have consent to publicize someone's name.
It's just like if you do something for a client and you would like to use it in a lecture, or you would like to use it as a part of your portfolio for renewal, you need the consent that the client
because not everyone is mindful of that. I don't know. You probably have seen Facebook posts where people just put up their results and you can see the names of other people, and not everyone is cool with that.
Well, yeah, that's and of course that goes back to some of the more uninformed people who really don't understand genealogy and just put family trees up with living people and things like that you really should have the consent of the people before you do things like that.
And that's why this conversation is really important, because many people are not interested in becoming professional genealogists, but they are interested in doing their own research and the extended family, and so these rules apply to them.
Right, and again, these two represent best practices, and standards that everyone should aspire to, not just people who are board certified or who aspire to be board certified. And it's all about recognizing privacy rights, and again, recognizing the risks of taking a DNA test. And I have to tell you, I've asked a number of my relatives to test, and some of them were happy to do it. Some of them took conversations by telephone or exchanges of emails. And that points to the fact that why you need to be well versed in the privacy limitations of each company, and you need to know enough to explain to test takers what their rights are and what the limitations are. Their consent will only be as informed as your knowledge.
Yeah. And that's true. I mean, I know a number of people who have tried to talk family members into doing tests, particularly a couple of cases where it really would help to advance the genealogical research if they could really answer questions, because there's not the traditional documents there to assist them. And in some cases, family members have said, absolutely not. I'm not willing
I
to
haven't
do
pushed
it.
people, and I think it's better, I think, if someone says no, I don't try to argue them into doing it. I did have one cousin who needed to go to lunch and talk about it, and then said, I'm going to say he or she, so when I identified anyone would test, and then got the test and sat on it. And ended up sending it back to me. I was not quite sure of what the issue was, but some people are just uncomfortable, and I haven't tried to push people into doing it one way or the other. Some people are eager to test for different reasons.
Yeah. So, one of the other things, we've kind of talked about the ethics of doing things like this. Are there other ethical issues that we should be looking at?
I have a question before, and that's in terms of all the tools, and you may or may not know the answer. I don't, for sure. But in addition to GEDmatch, there's GEDCOM, and there's DNA Painter, and there's all these tools. And I don't know if GEDmatch is GEDCOM is open source too, isn't it?
And I'm not sure about that.
Okay, I'm not either. So we'll deal with that on that.
There are other tools that you download to your computer, so it's not on a public
Okay, so
database.
it's just a tool, and then it wouldn't be,
And GEDmatch, though, is the largest, I believe. I think last I heard it was like 1.3 million testers, and even that small number compared to the databases of the commercial companies, apparently is enough for law enforcement to work with, at least with white Americans. I read an article that suggested that. They can pretty much narrow down suspects to about 20 people just on the basis of that small database.
But they had to, on the Golden State, I just read this, I don't know if it's true, but they had to go all back, like 10 generations back, and then start eliminating.
Well, this is the thing, and I'm not sure of how many generations they went back, but it does point out what we talked about in an earlier segment, that you need traditional documentary research. You can't just hone in on the DNA and be certain, especially when you're looking at third or fourth cousins, about the identity. So you use the DNA evidence in combination with traditional record research.
And that's why they're contacting all of those potential relatives to try to get that.
And I think that they're just counting on hit or miss. I've been contacted not because about a kit that I administer, not by law enforcement, but by one of those reality shows. And it's because I foolishly or not use my personal email because for the kits that I administer, but now I think people will be more mindful about that.
Yeah.
Well, and there, was it your family that you were contacted for the reality show, or?
Well, it was someone
someone
in
you
my
did?
family. It was a
Okay.
cousin, a cousin whose kid who is related to me, but the subject of the reality show was not in my family. It was not a blood relative,
You know,
a biological relative.
And of course, one of the things just to point out with those reality shows, we only see the ones that they're successful.
And
You
we
know,
and we
there-
don't
there are
necessarily
others
see all the
that-
work that goes into
No,
it.
I know
no.
that we don't see the work that goes into it. There's a lot of work. I mean, I personally know a couple of people who have done work on some of those shows and done the research. And the other thing is, some of them, just like anybody else, they hit the brick wall, and there's nothing that you can do to get around it. And so those shows don't happen. We don't see them come on to television. One friend of mine that was doing work, and I think it was a country music star, that they just hit a brick wall, and nothing they could do could get them past the brick wall. So that show never went into production. So.
But DNA is one of the reasonably exhaustive research pieces.
That may help.
Where it's relevant.
Where
like
it's
any
relevant.
other issue. You start out with a research question where DNA may be relevant, and then yes, that is something that, but again, it may not be available. Just as in burnt counties, there may be records competent genealogists would consult, but that may not exist anymore.
If you have relatives who refuse to do the DNA, then it's not available.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We are out of time. LaBrenda, we want to thank you for coming and spending the time with us. We really
I was happy to
appreciate
be
it.
here.
Thank
Thank you for
you.
inviting me.
Thank you.